In the waning months of year 2024, we find Snowpiercer being prepared for her final departure. Its career as a rail liner was undoubtedly short-lived, but Mr. Wilford is filled with a great resolve. The engineering of his magnificent train shall now be put to the test in the face of the looming threat. The train as a whole is a technological marvel, and the most important piece of it all would have to be the perpetual motion engine. Before we continue with the video, please note that the original video's link can be found in the description. Though some of the information in this video is identical to its predecessor, some ideas have changed with time, and I will be going over certain ideas more clearly and concisely, as the aging of the previous video has always given rise to more and more questions than it originally answered. In addition, this explanation will rely on the physics and logic of the show, with earlier seasons being taken as more credible than newer ones. Ergo, the electrolysis answer is rendered void. Though many would like a completely accurate to reality answer, that's simply not plausible if one truly wishes to enjoy a sci-fi fantasy series for what it is. And so with that out of the way, please enjoy the video. The Perpetual Motion Engine, the pride of Wilford Industries. For all its greatness, it too starts in a basic, dormant state. But how this great behemoth works is unlike anything else in the world. Though undoubtedly more complex than this, we can imagine the Perpetual Motion Engine as a turbine or a set of turbines. Just like any other turbine, it produces electrical power once turned. Power which is then used to move the train as a whole and power all of the amenities for third, second, and first class. However, this turbine is not turned by anything conventional at all, and seemingly breaks the laws of physics and thermodynamics like toothpicks. For this is no ordinary turbine. This is the core of a perpetual motion engine. So if nothing conventional turns the turbines like steam, water, or wind, then what does? The answer is the starting fuse, or as of this video, the set fuse. The set fuse is not a literal mechanical device within the engine, mind you, but is an important concept to understand how the perpetual motion engine operates, and how it is started up in the first place, as it acts as the maximum electrical load the perpetual motion engine can produce, either out of maximum electrical loads, or by the engine itself simply lacking the endurance. Returning to the engine's dormant state, presumably in a train yard, an initial electrical flow is supplied to the system. This initial flow is building up the set fuse and is cycling up the engine by turning the turbines. Depending on the urgency of the departure, we can cycle up the set fuse in one of two ways. On one hand, we can charge up the turbines to their set rotational speed by simply powering them up to said speed, or we can induce a single amount of energy and cycle up from there. For the benefit of making this explanation easier and flowing much better, we shall go with the latter option and start the perpetual motion engine with just a single jolt of energy. The smaller the energy jolt, the longer it would take, but under these principles, you could theoretically start a perpetual motion engine with something as small as a AAA battery, so long as the energy is enough to overcome the static friction of the turbines, which, unfortunately for Snowpiercer and Big Alice, is much greater than what a AAA battery is able to conquer. However, once this small amount of electricity is acquired, the turbines will spin and continue to do so. The train is now officially made self-sufficient. Without continuous force, the turbines will eventually run themselves out, choking the train of power. The answer is obvious to those who know of the Snowpiercer: perpetual motion. As soon as the turbines begin to spin, they immediately feed power into the numerous battery cars in the train, which is what allows the turbines to continue spinning. If you wanted to speed up the cycling process, you could direct additional power from these batteries to the turbines to cause them to increase their spin rates. Or, if you wanted to slow the process down, you can simply apply brakes to the turbine and slow it down, with the consequences being reduced power output and, in the worst case scenario, the choking of the engine as a whole, which leads to the self-sustaining power output to begin getting dragged down by friction until the engine eventually dies. However, in a normal scenario, the engine will continue cycling up until the perpetual motion engine reaches its maximum possible output, which then allows the train to safely start moving, though movement before this isn't more than possible. However, the turbines alone cannot produce enough energy to move the entire train on her own, thus another principle begins to take effect. Once the train begins to move, so too do all of her wheels begin to turn, which is exactly where all of the newly needed power shall originate from. As the wheels begin to turn, they power the batteries on the train, which in turn can power the motors which turn the wheels, a completely self-sustainable cycle that grows exponentially, at least on paper. Though the principles are perpetual, the storage capacity of the batteries and the load on the electrical system is not infinite, and so, at some point, the train's power output will in fact peak. However, now, the train is in motion, theoretically forever. However, even with the perpetual motion engine's physics-defying abilities, the train itself is not immune to the conditions of the outside world. While going downhill gives the train free energy which might not be usable, going uphill does the opposite and more. While going uphill, the train must use more energy to turn her wheels in general, while the wheels provide the same amount of energy or less, depending on if the wheel's RPM is changed by going up the slope, which it likely is. Though this can be handled well if the train has sufficient battery reserves, attempting to climb a steep grade with low batteries can mean disaster. As the train climbs, it may drain its batteries and may start to run low. As this happens, the motors powering the wheels begin to starve and slow, leading to less power going to the batteries, leading to lower RPMs in the wheels, which leads to less power going to the batteries. This leads to a vicious cycle where the motors are commanded to use more power to climb the grade until they eventually just grind to a halt, and the batteries officially die, which in turn consequentially leads to the perpetual motion engine dying as well. However, thanks to the wheels being built to absorb power from their own rotation to charge the batteries, failing to climb a grade is not entirely disastrous. Once the train grinds to a halt, it may very quickly begin to roll back down the hill, feeding power through the wheels into the batteries and back into the perpetual motion engine, thus reigniting the system. This principle also means that the train can be hypothetically started by parking the train on a hill and then releasing the brakes, causing the train to roll back down the hill and acquire energy that way. The other two scenarios in which the system can lose power are where the train is being pushed above or below its normal operating capacity. In the case where the train is pushed above, it will begin to use its energy reserves for the sake of gaining more speed. However, the increased rotation of the wheels is not converted into the appropriately needed energy due to the electrical system not being built to handle the absorption of that much energy. In the worst case scenario, the train's electrical system fails and fries itself. In the better case, which I find to be more plausible, is that a scenario is simply created where more energy is being spent than is being produced. Thus, the batteries die, the engine dies, and the train begins to slow, until the wheels slow enough to where power can be harvested again safely, and the engine is then restarted whilst in motion. However, the consequences are potentially far more consequential in the scenario where the train is pushed far below its normal operating capacity for the sake of slowing far below normal speeds or even stopping the train completely. In this instance, the train's wheels produce less and less power, recharging their own batteries less and less. However, this is not inherently an issue as the perpetual motion engine and the locomotive can be kept at full power, thus keeping the train completely active. However, this, unlike any other state, depending on whether or not you disagree with the shorted electrical system theory, is the most dangerous of them all. Whilst failing to climb a hill and pushing the train past its top performance margin both provide a means for reigniting the perpetual motion engine's turbine's movement, the third scenario, that of slowing down or stopping completely, does not. Though you may wonder why this is an issue if I had just said the perpetual motion engine and the locomotive is enough to keep the train active, that statement does not take into account other variables. Though the perpetual motion engine can charge the batteries fully in a system where its only constituents are still wheels, the perpetual motion cannot, however, do so if it must power the life support systems of 1001 cars, as in the case of the Snowpiercer. In that instance, if enough time is given, the strain eventually becomes too much. The life support systems siphon out all the power from the batteries, eventually killing the perpetual motion engine, and by connection all life on board, as well as any chance of reigniting the system. However, this can work in the exact opposite effect where the train isn't being called upon to produce more power, and then the turbine is just producing more and more power even though it's not supposed to be, so it's increasing heat, and it can't reduce its power anymore because if it reduces its power too much, then it will wind up succumbing to static friction and eventually stifling the engine. The fact of life support is a dominating factor in why any of these aforementioned scenarios could be lethal to the operators in the show. Though the idea of rolling the train back to life is indeed plausible and quite easy, and has even been demonstrated in the show, the idea which makes it not an easy or possible action for the characters of Snowpiercer simply comes down to the killer of all things: time. Though the math is likely something I and many of us cannot know for sure, what is almost certain is that the time it would take to roll the engines back to life would not be enough to save most of, if not any, of the passengers on Snowpiercer. In fact, the perpetual motion engine cannot at all save her benefactors forever. Yes, she may be a perpetual motion engine, blessed by immortality so long as she is used carefully, but the parts on the train are neither immortal nor perpetual. Over time, things wear down and break, an electrical moderation box here, a motor there, a few loose bolts here and there. Piece by piece, the perpetual motion engine loses its ability to regenerate that energy it has spent. And so, when you really think about it, sure, The Perpetual Motion Engine, along with its numerous team of unsung heroes, does seem to exhibit some capacity to produce a perpetual energy, but at the end of the day, I think Bennett Knox at the end of Season 1 put it best. There is no perpetual motion, because there are no perpetual parts. Nothing lasts forever, nothing is perpetual. Even if motion were made perpetual like in Mr. Wilford's turbines, which may very well be simple, basic turbines with a secret super lubricant formula, material wouldn't be capable of facilitating that. Everything wears away. No matter what you do, a machine will eventually need maintenance. I think this is merely an example of why engineers like Bennett Knox and Mr. Wilford were, at the end of the day, smarter than engineers like Melanie Cavill. Miss Cavill was always focused on pushing Snowpiercer more and more and more concerned about long-term survival than what was happening right now. Whereas on the other hand, you have engineers like Bennett Knox and Mr. Wilford, engineers who minded the now, who worried not about the slow, millennia-long decay of the perpetual motion engine, but about the issues that affected the train in the now, overuse of precious energy, and depletion of irreplaceable spare parts. You can expect a part 2 of this video explaining the differences between Big Alice and Snowpiercer in a more clear and concise way, such as in this video, but until then, hang in there, engineers. Stay warm, and until next time.